Let's talk Tanya for the 12th day of the first Adar. So we're in the middle of the process of mevachenli, of ego crushing. And the Tanya of the last 2 days, we're talking about how we crush our ego by contemplating the fact that our identity is associated with that of the animal soul. We have a godly soul, but we are the animal soul. And obviously this is difficult for us to digest, this idea that we are the animal soul. We'll get to that a little later in today's Tanya, but first, we're going to take the ego crushing one step further. We're saying over here, we are essentially low. We are associated with the animal soul. The animal soul is klipa. It is sourced in an unholy energy. And in that way, it would seem that we're similar to everything else here in this world. Whether it's the inanimate tables, chairs, rocks, trees, animals, everything after all is from klipa. Alter Rebbe says, actually, you're worse than all of those. You're worse than the animal. You're worse even than the non-kosher animal. And how is that? At the end of the day, everything else in this world, even though it's from klipa, doesn't have a desire to do differently than that which God wants them to do. The animal has its God-given nature, and it doesn't actually go against what God wants it to do, it doesn't even have a desire to do differently than what God wants it to do. We are the only creatures that actually, we are so not in sync with God. Our animal soul is so not in sync with God that God wants us to do one thing, and we want to do the opposite. Now think about that in a relationship. What does that say about a relationship when you're in a relationship with someone and they want one thing and you want the exact opposite? That is how distant we are from God. So we are ultimately distant from God, which obviously, if a person is a spiritual person and desires a relationship with God, taking some time to think about this, again, is a really crushing blow to the ego. What do we do with all of this? Is this really what we're supposed to be thinking? And we're supposed to be thinking about how lowly and distant from God we are? So, first of all, let's remind ourselves of something that I said a few days ago, that this entire method that we're talking about over here, this entire mevachenli, is option B. It's not option A. Option B means that it's only there if the option A, which is the Chabad method. Usually we're supposed to be focused in a positive way, and the mind is supposed to be focused on thinking about the beauty and the greatness of God and of Torah and mitzvahs, and thereby developing emotions. We're talking here about an instance where that's not working, which, as we explained, the reason why it's not working is because the ego is too strong. The ego is too tough. So this is a necessary evil. And even so, even when we have this necessary evil, we have to keep in mind that there are different truths that can coexist. So let's talk about this. For example, we're saying that our default self, as we spoke at length yesterday, 2 days ago, our default self, our default identity is that of the animal soul. Is that true? Absolutely. The proof is right there, right? What is our most natural desires? Are not desires for Torah, mitzvahs, holiness, selflessness. They're selfish desires. That is our default self, our natural self. Is that our deepest and most essential self? The answer to that is a resounding no. The deepest self of a Jew, as we learned earlier on in Tanya, is a desire to connect with God to the point that a Jew is willing to give up their life so as not to disconnect from God. So all the pleasures in the world, you wake up in the morning, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, but all of those pleasures are nothing compared to your deepest and most essential desire, which is to connect to God. So here we have a disconnect between your deepest and most essential self and what is your default setting. And by the way, that's true in many areas of life. If you're going to ask yourself, what are my deepest desires, but are those at the same time, when I wake up in the morning on a daily basis, is that what I'm thinking about? Is that my default setting? The answer is no. And the whole trick of Tanya is to try to identify more with our essential self rather than our default self. So we have these two truths. My deepest, most essential self is my godly soul. My default self is my animal soul. And by the way, the same thing is regarding what we said earlier today in Tanya. We said, we are so low and detestable because, and so distant from God because we desire things that go against what God wants. But this is now chapter 29. 2 chapters ago in Tanya, chapter 27, we spoke about how amazing it is that we have desires that are antithetical to what God wants, because then we can do iskafia, which means we can suppress our animal soul and thereby give God such incredible pleasure. Or to put it in different words, it's only because we want to do things that are antithetical to God's desires that we have free choice that makes us so special. So there's always two ways of looking at it. I could look at it and say, my deepest self is my godly core. And the fact that I have desires that are unholy desires, that's also good. And the reason for that is because it gives me the ability to suppress my animal soul and give God pleasure. Then you can also choose to look at the other side, which is also equally true, which is that our default self is the animal soul. And that ultimately the fact that I do have desires that are diverged, that are different than what God wants of me, makes me very distant from God. The question is, which one am I going to focus on? So usually, as Hasidim, we're focused on the positive. We're focused on the good. However, over here, we have a very specific goal in mind, which is we need to crush the ego. And by the way, this is not something which is long-lasting. We need to crush it and move on, and then move back to positive space. But when we are in this process of crushing the ego, we need to focus on the truths that might not be so pleasant. And that accomplishes the goal of breaking the ego, which will then allow the excitement, the passion, and the emotions of the godly soul to take hold. In tomorrow's Tanya, we are going to discuss the next step in Mivachenle, the next step in ego crushing.